On a quiet evening in the fall, a black woman, in a simple gray coat, walked into one of the most respected restaurants in the city, and nobody in that room had any idea who she truly was. She carried no entourage, no security detail, no visible marker of power, only a worn leather bag slung over one shoulder, and the tired eyes of someone who had spent the entire day making decisions that would shape the lives of millions of people she would never meet. She had just left a closed session of the Supreme Court of the United States, where arguments had run 3 hours longer than scheduled, and all she wanted now was a warm meal and a moment of silence before returning to an empty house. A young hostess greeted her with a polite nod and led her to a table near the window, unaware that the woman following her held one of the 9 most powerful legal minds in the entire nation. Within 20 minutes, a patrol car would pull up outside, and by the time the sun rose the next morning, a police officer's career would be finished, and a city would be forced to look at itself in a mirror it had spent years avoiding. This is the story of that night, and of what happens when arrogance mistakes silence for weakness. Her name was Vanessa Carter, 56 years old, and for nearly a decade she had served as an associate justice on the highest court in the land. She had grown up in a small house, with peeling paint in a working-class neighborhood, the daughter of a mail carrier and a school teacher who had taught her that dignity was not something anyone could hand you or take away from you, no matter how they tried. She had earned her way through law school on scholarships and long nights, argued cases before judges who doubted she belonged in the room, and eventually became one herself, sitting in a chair that history had rarely reserved for someone who looked like her. Despite the robes and the title, she never let herself become someone who needed to be recognized to feel important. She drove an aging blue sedan. Instead of accepting a chauffeured car, she still darned her own sweaters, and she preferred the company of strangers at a diner counter over the company of senators at a gala. Colleagues at the court often said that Vanessa Carter possessed the rarest kind of authority, the kind that never needed to raise its voice to be heard. That evening, she had changed out of her formal attire in her chambers, folding her black robe carefully over the back of her chair, and had slipped into a plain navy blazer and dark trousers, the outfit of someone who wanted, just for one meal, to disappear into the ordinary rhythm of the world. She chose a restaurant 2 blocks from her office, a place known for its warm lighting, its low music, and its clientele of business executives, lobbyists, and the occasional senator having a quiet dinner away from cameras. The hostess seated her at a small table by the window, and a waiter named David took her order with the easy friendliness of someone used to serving important people who did not want to be treated as important. Vanessa thanked him twice, complimented the bread, and asked about his evening, the kind of small kindness that cost her nothing, and that most of the room around her never noticed. Nearby, a table of investment bankers laughed loudly over wine, and 2 tables away, a couple celebrated an anniversary with a bottle of champagne they clearly could not really afford. Nobody at any of those tables knew that the tired woman by the window had, earlier that same day, cast a vote that would be studied by law students for the next 50 years. Vanessa had earned her seat on the court after decades of quiet, relentless work that rarely made headlines, arguing cases in cramped county courtrooms long before she ever stood before senators during her confirmation hearings. She remembered those early years vividly, the nights she spent studying by lamplight in a rented apartment with a leaking radiator, the senior partners who assumed she had been hired to fill a quota rather than to win cases. She had proven them wrong one verdict at a time, never with anger, but with a discipline so thorough that even her harshest critics eventually ran out of arguments against her. Friends often asked how she managed to remain so composed under pressure, and she would simply say that anger was expensive and she preferred to spend her energy on things that actually changed outcomes. That philosophy had carried her from a modest courthouse in a forgotten county all the way to the marble steps of the nation's highest court, and it had never once failed her, not in 30 years of practice. Tonight, sitting quietly by the window with a cup of tea cooling in front of her, she had no reason to believe it would fail her now either. A few of the other diners glanced her way, with the idle curiosity strangers give one another in a crowded room, nothing more, nothing less. She did not fit the practiced mold of wealth on display that filled most of the tables around her, and in a room built on unspoken hierarchies, That was enough to make a few eyes linger a second too long. She noticed nothing unusual in it, because she had lived 56 years learning to carry herself through rooms that were never built with her in mind, and she had long ago stopped letting a glance disturb her peace. She opened the small notebook she always carried, jotted a private thought about a legal brief she would review the next morning, and allowed herself, for the first time that day, to simply breathe. Outside the window, the city moved in its usual restless hurry, taxis honking, pedestrians hurrying home, streetlights flickering on one by one against the darkening sky. Inside, the restaurant hummed along in its comfortable, oblivious rhythm, unaware that the peace of the evening was about to be shattered. At exactly 8:40, a marked police cruiser eased to a stop directly outside the restaurant's glass entrance, and its driver's door swung open. Officer Ryan Collins stepped out of the cruiser with the unhurried confidence of a man who had never once been asked to justify himself. He was 39 years old, broad-shouldered, with a jaw that seemed permanently set in suspicion, and 11 years on, the force had taught him exactly how much authority a uniform could buy in rooms like this one. He believed, without ever admitting it aloud, that he had a talent for reading people, an instinct for who belonged somewhere and who did not, and he trusted that instinct more than he trusted evidence. Colleagues at the precinct considered him reliable, even a bit of a hard case, someone who followed procedure to the letter, though what they rarely saw was how selectively he chose to apply that procedure, depending on who stood in front of him. He walked through the restaurant's front door, with his thumbs hooked into his belt, and the maitre d' straightened instinctively, the way people do when uniformed authority enters a room uninvited. Collins scanned the space slowly, table by table, the way a man scans a room he has already decided he understands. His eyes moved past the bankers, past the anniversary couple, and settled, without hesitation, on the quiet woman reading a notebook by the window. Ryan Collins had grown up 2 towns over, the son of a factory foreman who used to tell him that respect was something you took, not something you waited around for other people to give you. He had joined the force at 28 after a string of jobs that never quite fit him, drawn less by any real sense of public service than by the authority the uniform seemed to hand him the moment he put it on. Over 11 years, he had built a quiet reputation among certain colleagues as a man who trusted his gut over his paperwork, a habit that had never once cost him anything, because the people his gut usually targeted rarely had the standing to push back. Nobody at the precinct had ever formally challenged him on it, and in the absence of consequence, that habit had calcified into something he mistook for skill. He walked into rooms already having decided who belonged and who did not, and he had never once been wrong in a way that mattered to his career, until tonight. Something about her stillness struck him as wrong, though if pressed, he could not have explained exactly why. She did not fit the tempo of the room in his mind, and in the small, closed circuit of his judgment, that was reason enough to act. He approached the hostess stand and asked, in a low voice, whether anyone had reported a disturbance that evening, and the young hostess, caught off guard, said she was not aware of any complaint. Undeterred, Collins told her that dispatch had received a call about a person acting suspiciously inside the restaurant, though no such call had ever come through his radio, and no such call would ever appear in the records later reviewed by investigators. He walked directly toward Vanessa's table, his boots striking the hardwood floor with a deliberate, heavy rhythm that drew the attention of nearby diners. He stopped beside her chair, close enough that his shadow fell across her notebook, and he said nothing at first, only stared, as though waiting for her to flinch. When she finally looked up and met his gaze evenly, he spoke the first words of a night that would follow him for the rest of his life. "Ma'am, I need you to stand up," he said, his voice pitched loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. Vanessa set down her pen slowly and studied him for a moment, not with fear, but with the calm, measuring patience of someone who had spent decades listening to arguments before deciding whether they held any weight. "May I know why?" she asked, her tone even, without a trace of the anger the moment might have justified. Collins folded his arms and said simply, "Because I said so," as though the badge on his chest made any further explanation unnecessary. A hush fell over the nearby tables, the kind of silence that spreads through a public room right before everyone pretends not to be listening. The bankers stopped mid-sentence. The couple celebrating their anniversary set down their glasses. Vanessa Carter remained seated, her hands folded neatly on the table, and asked him, quietly, to explain what law she had broken. And Officer Collins, for the first time that evening, hesitated before answering. He recovered quickly, choosing volume over reason, and demanded to see identification, insisting that a restaurant of this caliber had rules about who could occupy its tables during peak hours. Vanessa reached into her bag without protest and produced her driver's license, sliding it calmly across the table toward him, her expression never wavering from its composed stillness. Collins glanced at it for barely 2 seconds before tossing it back onto the tablecloth, unsatisfied, as though the document itself had failed some invisible test he alone understood. He then asked whether she had enough money to pay for her meal, a question that landed in the room like a slap, drawing gasps from 2 nearby tables and a sharp intake of breath from the waiter standing frozen near the kitchen door. Several guests had already begun quietly raising their phones, angling them toward the unfolding scene, capturing footage that would soon travel far beyond the restaurant's 4 walls. Emily Brooks, the restaurant's 32-year-old manager, hurried over from the back office, alarmed by the commotion, and found herself caught instantly between her professional instinct to diffuse conflict and her deep-seated fear of contradicting a police officer in front of her customers. She asked Collins, in a trembling voice, what the problem was, and he answered, without looking at her, his eyes still fixed on Vanessa, that the woman needed to leave immediately. Vanessa Carter asked one more time, her voice never rising, whether she was violating any specific law or restaurant policy, and the question hung in the air like a held breath. Collins did not answer directly, because there was no honest answer he could give, and instead he repeated his demand with greater force, telling her that she needed to leave before he made her leave. Emily, caught in the gravitational pull of his uniform and his certainty, turned to Vanessa and asked apologetically if she would mind stepping outside to avoid further disturbance to the other guests. It was, in that instant, easier for Emily to ask an innocent woman to sacrifice her evening than to challenge the armed man standing in her restaurant, and she would spend many sleepless nights afterward regretting that choice. A retired serviceman seated 2 tables away rose to his feet, unable to stay silent any longer, and said clearly, for the whole room to hear, that the woman had done absolutely nothing wrong. Collins spun toward him and barked at him to stay out of police business, his hand instinctively drifting toward his belt, a gesture that made several diners flinch. The room, which moments earlier had been filled with the comfortable murmur of ordinary conversation, now sat in a tense, electric silence, every eye fixed on the small, terrible drama playing out beside the window. Collins reached toward the back of Vanessa's chair and pulled it out sharply, the legs screeching against the floor, and in the sudden motion, a glass of water tipped and spilled across the white tablecloth, soaking the pages of her open notebook. A few onlookers audibly gasped, and someone near the bar muttered that this had gone too far, though nobody yet dared to intervene beyond raised phones and lowered voices. Vanessa Carter did not raise her voice, did not flinch, did not offer him the satisfaction of a reaction he could later describe as resistance. She simply rose from her seat with the same unhurried grace she carried into every courtroom, smoothed the front of her blazer, and said quietly that she would leave, since the manager herself had asked. Emily could not meet her eyes as she said it, her cheeks burning with a shame she could not yet name, and the retired serviceman shook his head slowly, disgusted by what he was witnessing. Collins, satisfied that he had won, stepped back with his arms crossed, wearing the faint, self-assured smile of a man who believed the matter was now closed. Nearly everyone in that restaurant believed, in that moment, that the humiliating scene had finally reached its end. Vanessa Carter gathered her bag, tucked her damp notebook beneath her arm, and walked calmly toward the door, her heels clicking softly against the wooden floor in the otherwise silent room. Every step she took carried the weight of decades spent proving, over and over again, that composure could be its own form of power, that a raised voice was rarely the loudest thing in a room. She reached the entrance, paused with her hand resting lightly on the brass door handle, and then, unexpectedly, turned back to face the room she was being forced to leave. Officer Collins straightened, expecting a final protest, perhaps tears, perhaps an outburst he could use to justify everything that had just happened. Instead, Vanessa reached into the inner pocket of her blazer, withdrew a small white card, and walked back toward Emily Brooks, placing it gently into her trembling hand. Emily looked down at the card, and the color drained visibly from her face as she read the words printed there in simple black lettering. It identified the woman who had just been humiliated in front of an entire restaurant as Vanessa Carter, Associate Justice, Supreme Court of the United States. Emily's hand shook so violently that the card nearly slipped from her fingers, and she looked up at Vanessa with an expression somewhere between horror and disbelief. Officer Collins, watching the exchange from a few feet away, let out a short, dismissive laugh, convinced the card was nothing more than a clever fake meant to intimidate him into backing down. He told her, with a smirk he would soon deeply regret, that plenty of people carried fancy cards and that a piece of cardstock did not impress him in the slightest. Vanessa turned to look at him directly, for the first time since she had risen from her chair, and her voice, when it came, was calm, quiet, and utterly without malice. "You'll know soon enough," she said, and there was nothing theatrical in the way she said it, only the simple certainty of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be believed. She did not wait for his response. She turned, pushed open the heavy glass door, and stepped out into the cool night air, disappearing down the sidewalk without once looking back. Inside, the restaurant remained frozen in stunned silence, the weight of what had just happened settling slowly over every table like a held breath finally released. Among the diners who had watched the entire scene unfold was a man named Marcus Hill, 45 years old, a civil rights attorney who had, over the course of his career, argued 3 separate cases before the very court on which Vanessa Carter sat. He recognized her the moment she rose from her seat, though he had said nothing during the confrontation itself, choosing instead to quietly record every second of it on his phone, understanding instinctively that evidence would matter more than intervention in that particular moment. As soon as the glass door swung shut behind her, Marcus stood, walked briskly toward Emily, who was still staring blankly at the card in her hand, and confirmed in a low, urgent voice that the woman who had just left was, without any doubt, exactly who the card claimed she was. He had watched her question witnesses from the bench with surgical precision, had studied her written opinions late into countless nights, and there was no mistaking the calm authority that radiated from her even when she was being wrongfully forced from a restaurant. Within minutes, Marcus had uploaded his video to the internet, along with a brief, carefully worded account of exactly what he had witnessed. He made no accusations beyond what the footage itself already showed, trusting, as any good attorney would, that the truth needed no exaggeration to be devastating. The video spread with a speed that stunned even those who understood how quickly outrage could travel in the modern world. Within the first hour, it had been viewed several 100,000 times, and by midnight, that number had climbed past several million, shared across every corner of the internet by people who had never met either Vanessa Carter or Ryan Collins, but who recognized, instantly, the shape of what they were watching. Legal scholars wrote long, furious analyses of the footage before sunrise. Retired judges who had once sat beside Vanessa on lower courts issued public statements defending her character and integrity. Civil rights organizations that had spent years documenting patterns of discriminatory policing seized upon the video as a devastatingly clear example of exactly the behavior they had long tried to expose. Newsrooms that had been preparing entirely different stories for their morning broadcasts scrapped their schedules and redirected every available reporter toward the unfolding scandal. Talk shows that had spent the morning preparing entirely different segments scrapped their lineups to bring in legal analysts and former officers willing to dissect the footage frame by frame on live television. Op-ed writers at major papers filed columns before dawn, some focused narrowly on the specifics of the incident, others widening their lens to examine decades of similar encounters that had never been caught on camera and had therefore never demanded national attention. A congresswoman who had once clerked for Vanessa early in her own legal career, posted a lengthy statement online defending her former mentor's character, reminding readers that composure under such treatment was not the absence of pain, but its most disciplined expression. Meanwhile, ordinary citizens who had never met either woman found themselves telling their own smaller, uncaptured versions of the same story, filling comment threads and radio call-in shows with memories of being doubted, questioned, and dismissed in rooms where they had every right to belong. The video had become, almost overnight, less a story about two individuals and more a mirror held up to a much larger and more uncomfortable pattern. Emily Brooks, sitting alone in the restaurant's back office long after closing, watched the numbers climb on her phone screen with a rising, nauseating dread, understanding for the first time the true scale of what her silence had helped enable. Officer Ryan Collins, unaware that his name was already spreading across the internet, drove home that night, still convinced, in the quiet, stubborn corner of his mind, that he had done absolutely nothing wrong. Word reached Police Chief Daniel Morgan shortly after 11 that night, when an aide called his private line and told him, without preamble, that he needed to see a video that was already spreading across every major news outlet in the country. Morgan was 58 years old, a man who had spent 30 years rising through the ranks of a department he genuinely believed in, and he watched the footage twice in complete silence before saying a single word. What he saw troubled him deeply, not only because of what it showed, but because of how casually, how confidently, Officer Collins had carried himself throughout the entire encounter, as though the badge on his chest had made him untouchable. Morgan immediately requested the restaurant's security footage, along with the complete body cam recording from Collins's own patrol vehicle and uniform, refusing to let a single hour pass before gathering every available piece of evidence. What the body cam revealed only deepened his concern, because it captured, in Collins's own voice, moments before he entered the restaurant, a radio exchange confirming that no call had ever come through dispatch about any disturbance at that location. There had been no complaint, no witness report, no legitimate reason for Collins to have entered that restaurant at all that night. Chief Morgan closed his laptop, exhaled slowly, and picked up his phone to summon Officer Collins to headquarters before the sun rose. Collins arrived at the precinct just after 1 in the morning, still wearing his uniform, his expression carrying the same unshaken confidence it had held inside the restaurant hours earlier. Chief Morgan met him in a small conference room, the security footage already queued and waiting on the screen behind him, and asked Collins, calmly, to explain exactly what had happened that evening. Collins offered the same explanation he had rehearsed in his mind during the drive over, insisting that something about the woman's demeanor had struck him as suspicious, that experience had taught him to trust his instincts in unfamiliar situations. "I trusted my instincts," he said, folding his arms in the same posture he had used inside the restaurant, as though repetition of the gesture might restore the authority it had once carried. Morgan studied him for a long moment before responding, his voice quiet, but carrying an unmistakable weight. "No," he said, "you trusted your prejudice, and you dressed it up as procedure, and now the entire country has watched you do it." Collins opened his mouth to protest, but no words came, because for the first time all night, he understood that the ground beneath him had shifted completely. By the time morning light began filtering through the windows of the police headquarters, the Office of Internal Affairs had already opened a formal investigation, moving with a speed rarely seen in cases involving fellow officers. Investigators reviewed the body cam footage frame by frame, cross-referencing every second against the restaurant's own security cameras and the video Marcus Hill had captured on his phone, and every version of events told the exact same story. There had been no call to dispatch, no legitimate complaint, no factual basis whatsoever for Collins's actions beyond the assumptions he had made the instant he looked at Vanessa Carter across a crowded room. Emily Brooks was called in for a formal statement that morning, and she gave it through quiet, genuine tears, admitting openly that she had allowed her fear of contradicting a police officer to override her responsibility to protect an innocent guest. Marcus Hill provided his own statement and his original, unedited footage, adding the weight of his professional legal credibility to an already overwhelming body of evidence. News outlets across the country ran the story not as a piece of sinew scandal about a but as a broader reckoning with a pattern many Americans had lived through quietly. What made this case impossible to dismiss was not that the victim happened to be a sitting justice of the Supreme Court. It was that no citizen, regardless of who they were, should ever have to prove their worth to be treated with basic decency. Reporters descended on Vanessa Carter's chambers within hours, eager for a statement, a quote, any fragment of reaction they could broadcast to a nation hungry for her response. She declined every request for an interview, issuing instead a brief, measured written statement asking the public to allow the department's internal process to run its proper course without interference. Let the process do its work, she wrote, and those 5 words, calm and unadorned, only deepened the public's respect for a woman who had every reason to demand outrage on her behalf and chose restraint instead. Legal analysts noted, almost in disbelief, that she had not once used her position to pressure the investigation, had not called a single official to intervene, had simply trusted the same systems of accountability she had spent her career upholding from the bench. That restraint became, in its own quiet way, more powerful than any public statement of anger could have been, because it modeled exactly the kind of faith in due process that Collins himself had so thoroughly abandoned. Civil rights groups praised her composure while simultaneously demanding full accountability from the department, a balance the case seemed almost designed to test. Marcus Hill, watching the story dominate every headline in the country, remarked privately to a colleague that he had never seen a single piece of video footage carry so much weight in a matter of hours. Something had shifted in the public conversation, and everyone sensed that the coming days would decide exactly how far that shift would go. The formal disciplinary hearing was scheduled for 2 days later, moved forward at the department's own insistence, given the scale of public attention the case had already drawn. Officer Collins arrived flanked by a union representative and legal counsel, his posture still rigid, with a defiance that had not fully cracked despite everything that had already come to light. Members of the disciplinary board sat along a long table at the front of the room, and behind them, on a large screen, the evidence began to play in careful, methodical order, exactly as it had been gathered over the previous 48 hours. First came the restaurant's own security footage, capturing Collins's confident stride through the door and his immediate, unprompted focus on Vanessa's table. Then came his own body cam audio, confirming without any ambiguity that no call had ever come through dispatch that evening. Then came Marcus Hill's video, capturing the demand that she stand, the question about whether she could afford her meal, the pulled chair, the spilled water, and finally, the small white card that had changed everything. Each piece of evidence built upon the last with a quiet, inescapable weight, and by the time the recordings finished playing, there was no version of events left for Collins's attorney to argue. Outside the hearing room, a small crowd had gathered despite the early hour, drawn by news alerts that had circulated since the previous evening, some holding handwritten signs, others simply standing in quiet, watchful solidarity. Reporters lined the hallway with cameras angled toward the door, waiting for any scrap of information that might slip out before the official statement was released. Inside, the board members took careful notes as each piece of footage played, occasionally pausing the recording to ask Collins to clarify a specific moment, questions he answered with increasingly hollow certainty as the weight of the evidence mounted against him. His attorney attempted, at one point, to argue that heightened public tension around policing had created an unfair climate for a fair hearing, but the argument collapsed almost immediately under the sheer clarity of the recorded evidence itself. There was no ambiguity left to exploit, no gap in the footage wide enough to fit a reasonable doubt. The board deliberated for less than an hour before returning with its decision, a swiftness that reflected both the clarity of the evidence and the department's urgent need to demonstrate genuine accountability to a watching public. Officer Ryan Collins was terminated from the police force effective immediately, his badge and service weapon confiscated on the spot, his law enforcement certification revoked pending further review by the state licensing board. Legal experts speaking to reporters outside the hearing noted that Collins could still face a separate civil lawsuit, along with possible criminal charges related to filing a false report, since no legitimate call to dispatch had ever actually occurred. Collins said nothing as the decision was read aloud, his earlier defiance finally giving way to a hollow, defeated silence that seemed to age him considerably in the span of a single sentence. He gathered his belongings, declined to speak to the small crowd of reporters gathered outside the building, and walked to his car alone. The 11 years he had spent building a career now collapsed into a single viral video and a single choice made in a matter of seconds. Chief Morgan, addressing the press shortly afterward, spoke with the weight of a man who understood exactly how much trust his department had lost and exactly how much work lay ahead to rebuild it. A badge is not a license to disrespect another human being, Morgan told the assembled reporters the following morning, his voice steady despite the exhaustion visible on his face after 2 sleepless nights. It is a responsibility, and when an officer forgets that, the department has not only a right but an obligation to hold him accountable, regardless of the rank or reputation he believes he has earned. His words were carried on every major news broadcast that day, quoted in newspaper headlines from coast to coast, and cited repeatedly in the weeks that followed, as departments across the country re-examined their own training and oversight procedures. Emily Brooks, watching the press conference from her apartment, felt a complicated mixture of relief and lingering shame, knowing that accountability for Collins did not erase her own role in the events of that night. She reached out through the restaurant's corporate office and requested a private meeting with Vanessa Carter, uncertain whether the request would even be accepted after everything that had happened. To her quiet surprise, Vanessa agreed, and the 2 women met 3 days later in a small, empty cafe, far from the cameras and headlines that had consumed the previous week. Emily arrived early, her hands trembling slightly as she waited at a corner table, rehearsing an apology she had revised a dozen times in her mind since that terrible night. When Vanessa Carter walked in, dressed simply, carrying the same quiet composure she had carried through the entire ordeal, Emily rose immediately and began speaking before she had even fully sat down, the words tumbling out in an unpolished rush of genuine remorse. She admitted that fear had made her complicit, that she had chosen the path of least resistance in a moment that demanded courage instead, and that she understood if Vanessa never wanted to see her again. Vanessa listened without interrupting, her expression patient and unreadable, until Emily finally fell silent, exhausted by the weight of her own confession. Then Vanessa reached across the table, placed her hand gently over Emily's trembling one, and told her something that Emily would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Respect is not earned by titles," Vanessa said quietly. "It begins with how we treat strangers, long before we know anything about who they are or what they carry with them." Emily wept openly at the table, not from shame this time, but from the unexpected grace of being forgiven by someone she had genuinely wronged. News of the meeting eventually reached the press, though Vanessa declined to discuss its details publicly, beyond confirming that reconciliation, not resentment, had guided her approach to the entire ordeal. Legal scholars and commentators spent the following weeks dissecting the case from every possible angle, using it as a case study in discussions about bias, accountability, and the fragile mechanisms that were supposed to protect ordinary citizens from exactly what had happened to her. Police departments in several states announced reviews of their own bias training programs, citing the incident directly as a catalyst for renewed scrutiny. Marcus Hill was invited to speak at legal conferences about the power of bystander documentation, though he always insisted, with characteristic humility, that the true courage that night had belonged entirely to Vanessa Carter, who had faced humiliation with a composure most people could never hope to summon. Officer Ryan Collins largely disappeared from public view in the months that followed, his name occasionally resurfacing in follow-up articles about the ongoing civil litigation against him, a quiet coda to a career that had ended in a single viral evening. The city, for its part, seemed to carry the story with it long after the headlines faded, referenced in city council meetings and community forums, whenever conversations turned to trust between citizens and the officers meant to protect them. Nearly 1 month after that first terrible evening, Vanessa Carter returned to the same restaurant, choosing the exact same table by the window where everything had begun. This time, the hostess who greeted her at the door recognized her immediately, though she offered no special treatment, no fawning deference, only the same warm, professional welcome extended to every guest who walked through those doors. Emily herself came by the table partway through the meal, not to apologize again, since that debt had already been settled quietly between them weeks earlier, but simply to ask, as any good manager would, whether everything was to her satisfaction. Vanessa smiled and told her it was. And there was something quietly remarkable in the ordinariness of that exchange, in the way an entire restaurant had learned, through painful necessity, to treat one woman exactly the way it should have treated her from the very beginning. Outside the window, the city moved through its familiar evening rhythm, unaware that the same tired legal mind that had once been forced from that very table was now sitting calmly beside the glass, eating in peace. She lingered over her meal a little longer than usual that night, in no particular hurry, savoring not just the food, but the simple, hard-won normalcy of being treated like anyone else. When she finally rose to leave, she thanked her waiter, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cool evening air without a single glance drawing suspicion or scrutiny. What happened to Vanessa Carter on that ordinary autumn evening was never really about a table by the window, or a spilled glass of water, or even the badge that Ryan Collins ultimately lost. It was about the quiet, corrosive assumption that some people must prove they belong in a room before they are permitted to simply exist within it, an assumption carried unconsciously by far too many people who would never think to call themselves prejudiced. It was about the courage it takes to remain composed when the world demands your anger, and the deeper courage it takes to forgive when the world would understand your bitterness. It was about a manager who chose fear over fairness in a single terrible moment, and who found, through honest reckoning, the strength to choose differently afterward. It was about a police chief who understood that protecting the integrity of his department meant holding his own officers to the very standard they were sworn to uphold for everyone else. And it was about a city, and in many ways a country, forced once again to confront an uncomfortable truth it had spent generations trying to look away from. Justice, it turned out, was never only something that happened inside a courtroom. It began, always, in the small, unwitnessed moments of how one stranger chose to treat another. In the weeks that followed, the story continued to ripple outward in ways nobody could have fully predicted on that first chaotic night. Law schools across the country began citing the case in discussions about implicit bias and the limits of discretionary policing, professors building entire lecture sessions around the body cam footage and the calm, deliberate way Vanessa had responded to every escalation. Police academies revised portions of their training curricula, adding new modules specifically addressing the dangers of acting on unverified suspicion rather than documented cause. A handful of other cities, watching the fallout closely, launched their own internal reviews of similar complaints that had never before drawn serious attention, uncovering patterns that many officials admitted they had long suspected but never seriously investigated. None of it undid what had happened to Vanessa Carter on that ordinary evening, but all of it suggested that her composure and her refusal to let the moment define her with bitterness had opened a door that might otherwise have stayed closed indefinitely. She never spoke publicly about any of these downstream effects, preferring instead to let the work speak for itself, exactly as she always had throughout her long and quietly extraordinary career. Marcus Hill, for his part, found himself thinking often in the months that followed about how differently that night could have ended without a single camera rolling. He had built an entire career defending people who lacked the resources, the platform, or the simple luck to have their mistreatment documented and believed. And the case reminded him, more than any law school lecture ever had, just how fragile the line between justice and silence truly was. He continued his work with renewed purpose, taking on cases involving ordinary citizens whose stories would never trend online, whose only witnesses were their own memories, and whatever courage they could summon to speak them aloud. Emily Brooks, meanwhile, slowly rebuilt her sense of professional confidence, training her staff personally on how to handle situations where authority and fairness seemed to pull in opposite directions. She kept Vanessa's small white card in the top drawer of her desk, not as a trophy or a souvenir, but as a quiet, private reminder of the night she had learned, at real cost, what it meant to choose courage over comfort, power when it forgets the weight it carries, can destroy in a single evening what took years to build. And no uniform, no title, no badge has ever been a substitute for basic human decency. Every person, regardless of the color of their skin, the car they drive, or the clothes they wear into a room, deserves to be treated with the same fundamental respect owed to any human being. Ryan Collins learned that lesson only after it had already cost him everything, and by then, no apology he might have offered could undo the damage his assumptions had caused. Vanessa Carter, meanwhile, never once needed to raise her voice to prove she deserved a seat at that table, because true strength, she had long understood, rarely needs to shout to be heard. Somewhere in that city, a quiet blue sedan pulled away from the curb late one evening, carrying a woman who had faced humiliation and answered it with grace, who had faced injustice and answered it with faith in a system she still believed could be better. And long after the headlines faded and the video stopped trending and the world moved on to its next controversy, one simple truth remained, settled quietly into the conscience of everyone who had witnessed it. Respect was never meant to be a privilege granted to the powerful. It was always meant to be the baseline owed to every single person who walked through the door.